So I'm excited to have this conversation, mostly because I haven't had that many deep dives with like venture capitalists, and you work at Contrary, which is a VC. Wanted to maybe set the ground and just ask you like what Contrary is and like how you define it as a VC firm, and how you first got involved with the company.
Yeah. So Contrary as venture fund has been around for about 5 or 6 years. And the core ethos of the firm is this idea that if we can identify incredibly sharp people as early as possible in their career and then support them throughout their career, you have this unfair advantage in investing in the next generation of great companies. And the way that we think about that is identifying people in undergrad, grad school, PhD programs, top companies, whatever. And it's often a little bit of a game of telephone where it's meeting really sharp people. Who are your smartest friends? Let's go chat with people, bring them into the sort of inner circle. And what that translates into from an investing perspective is one of two things. Either we are leading pre-seed and seed rounds into companies started by people in that network, or often by sort of friends of friends of people in that network, but it's very people centric in the way that we think about investing. Or we're investing in companies you can look at for as examples like Ramp and Anduril, where a pretty sizable portion of their early teams came out of the Contrary network. And so we refer to that as investing in talent vortexes. So we'll also invest at the Series A, the Series B, what have you, into companies that we see, we may be not leading those rounds, or we may not have led those rounds at seed, but we're seeing those companies as the future talent vortexes. A ton of great people are going to get trained up there and then go start their own companies and things like that. So it often becomes this flywheel of we're just trying to find the sharpest people and invest where we can to be able to back those kinds of people.
Would like to better understand kind of your path to venture specifically, because when I graduated from Stanford in 2019, I had studied econ, and the traditional career paths were investment banking, consulting, or maybe some sort of like biz ops role at a large tech company. But a lot of people, especially in 2019, like their dream jobs would have been to go into venture capital right out of undergrad and basically get exposed to cutting edge ideas and technologies and to be able to fund the future. So I'm curious in terms of like just your career track of how you got into venture. Was that something that you had aspired to go down that track early on?
So I very much like stumbled into venture in a very specific way where it was not something that was on my radar. I didn't know a lot of people who worked in startups. The way that it happened was I was a videographer in school in undergrad. I was a film major. I was planning to go to Hollywood and stuff like that. And to pay the bills, I was making wedding videos and commercials and stuff like that. And eventually it got to the point where I had too many jobs. I couldn't do them all. And so I would go to a friend of mine who also did videography, and I'd say, hey, I got this job for you. Can I keep 5% of it and you go do it and whatever? Very quickly realized that I was dramatically better at selling and getting jobs than I was ever. I was never that talented of a videographer. Like my magnum opus was Pokemon Love Song, and it was all downhill from there, right? Like, so I was never very good at that, but I realized I was very good at going out and getting customers and stuff. So over the course of 4 years, kind of on and off with lots of ups and downs, hiring people and growing and stuff like that, I grew that business and then ended up selling it. But what's always funny to me to look back is that even while I was running that, I never called it a startup. I always called it a project. And part of me, I feel like, was maybe because I was already married at the time. And I was worried maybe that my mother-in-law would be suspect of me calling that a job or a company. So I always referred to it as sort of a project. And then when I sold it, I was kind of trying to think. I was talking to a friend of mine who I still know, and I work out with him in the morning still, which is crazy. But I was talking to him, and I was like, I don't know what to do next. And he was like, what did you enjoy most about running that company? And I said, I just loved being like a resource for these really passionate, creative people. And he was like, well, that's kind of what venture capitalists do. And I was like, I don't know what those words mean. And so I ended up getting connected to a seed fund. This was all out in Utah. I grew my company in Utah and then got connected to a seed fund here in Utah, and literally just at their whiteboard learned what even venture capital is as a business and stuff like that, and realized like, man, this is what I want to run at. And so kind of from then on, it's now, so this year is my 10th year in investing.
Wow. Congratulations. Was the company that you were running, the side project, so to speak, was that something you were doing while you were at college, or is that what you had been doing full time immediately after graduating?
Yeah, so I started it while I was in college and then ran it after college. And I kind of also had like taken time off, run it, come back. And then as I sort of sold it and graduated around the same time, and then was teaching at BYU and was working at this seed fund a little bit and doing a bunch of different things while I figured out like, hey, is this investing what I want to do?
I'm 27, and so I'm always curious about how other people had kind of approached their 20s from a professional landscape and what the thinking was with each stage. So you had, just looking at your early career, done a couple years at TCV, done a couple years at Cotu, and then done a couple years at Index. Could you talk a little bit about like how you were thinking through career progression, whether or not it was like strategic of like, this is the map that I want to go down, or how serendipitous it was?
So there was no map for sure. It was very much kind of, I have written before about this idea of like the natural selection of time, where like I allow things to sort of breathe, and the things that I am most interested in or most drawn to or whatever, those things end up surviving, and the things that I'm less interested in, I ultimately pull my attention away from. And so my whole life has been very much just like letting opportunities breathe. And then when one of them feels like it has real life, then I kind of dive into it. So it was very serendipitous. I'd say like the things that were a little bit more deliberate and that I can like articulate were more the changing points. Like, why did I want to make a change, as opposed to like, oh, why did I go to this specific place? It was like, what was I looking for? Yep. And that was the job to be done that my next thing kind of solved. And so when you think about like my first job in venture was at a seed fund in Utah, and I love those guys and I still know them. But when I looked at seed investing, I had spent most of my time running a company that had meat on the bones, as opposed to like the idea phase of a company. Whereas in seed investing, you're just frequently seeing the idea phase over and over and over again. And for me, I was more sort of intellectually stimulated by companies that have a little bit of meat on the bones. Maybe they don't have to be public companies or whatever, but to have a little bit of like things going for them, right? Maybe it's that sort of early inflection point where like they've hired the initial team, they've built the initial product, and now where do we go from here? That was kind of where I was my sweet spot, and I wasn't getting that in seed investing. And so I thought I want to go to the later stages of a company's life. And so I got connected to, there was a couple of BYU folks at TCV. And so I got connected to TCV that way and joined. And I love TCV. TCV was a great learning experience, but I realized pretty quickly that I had jumped maybe too far to the other end of the spectrum. Yep. Where TCV was investing, at least when I was there. They've changed a lot since I was there. But when I was there, they were investing in very late stage companies. And what I got out of TCV was a very rigorous like financial analysis and due diligence education. I never did investment banking, but I think of TCV as sort of the time that I was most forced to like get into the weeds on a business and like really learn the inner workings there. And so that was a really valuable education. But I realized like I really want to be investing in like the best companies at a stage where I can really engage with the founders. And so I sort of started looking for folks that maybe fit that bill a little bit more. And again, similarly, sort of just stumbled onto somebody I actually cold messaged a guy at Cotu on LinkedIn, and he responded, and that led to the role. Wow. And Cotu definitely scratched that itch where I was working much more closely with founders at that sort of stage and quality of company that I was really excited about. The experience that I had at Cotu, I would say is more so like Cotu is primarily a hedge fund. I was working on their private team. But hedge funds have a very specific, distinct culture. And it's pros and cons, like different people thrive in different environments. And sometimes it's exciting to be competitive externally. But for a lot of people, it's actually motivating to be competitive internally, where you're each kind of thinking about, and in hedge funds, that's very common because you each have a P&L that you're managing. And if my P&L is up and your P&L is down, I am outperforming you. And it's pretty easy to see. Yep. And that culture kind of becomes pervasive. And for a lot of folks, that works great. That was not my preference. I was much more excited to kind of collaborate with folks. And so I'd gotten to know a few of the folks at Index. And then again, similarly, it kind of scratched that itch of like, this was it's a much smaller team. It was, much more tight knit. And so I really enjoyed working with folks there. But even when I was at Cotu and in particular when I was at Index, I always felt this itch that I had from when I was running a company of like, I want to put my fingerprints on something. I want to meaningfully direct the future path of the thing I'm working on. And no disrespect to Index, but like it's a 20 plus year old firm, right? All these firms that I'd been at, they're 15, 20 plus years old. They're very well established. Like I'm excited and grateful to be along for the ride, but I was not necessarily in a position where like the future of Index was turning with me. And so when I started thinking about how can I scratch that itch? I wanted to stay in investing. I wasn't ready to start another company. And so I started thinking, well, a sort of startup venture fund could be a really interesting middle ground where it's a firm that's young enough that it's still being formed, but it's maybe a little bit established enough. I did, at the time I joined, I had 3 kids. And so I wasn't necessarily looking for 0 to 1 risk at the time.
Yep.
And Contrary was the perfect build, not only because of that setup, but also in particular because I was really pragmatic about like, what is the job to be done that I would want a venture fund to solve? Like, what is the product that I think a venture fund that is future proofed should be offering? And Contrary was perfectly set up to offer that product.
With respect to Contrary, the kind of tagline that you guys have is like talent and research driven. Would love to kind of explore both of those topics in a little bit more detail, specifically because I have been doing this learning sprint on marketing and advertising, a subject area where I feel like I just didn't have very deep insight. And I basically compiled like 10 to 15 of what are regarded as some of the best books by like David Ogilvy and Claude Hopkins and all these individuals. And one of the interesting things that comes up repeatedly is like this idea of positioning your product and the image that you conjure up in the mind of a consumer can sometimes outweigh the quality of the product itself. It's not always the best product wins. It's the product that comes and has a very specific image in the mind of the consumer. And you talk a lot about venture capital, the landscape in general, the competitive landscape. And it's interesting to track how like personal brands have become very much a key part of differentiating yourself as an individual, but then also firms kind of differentiating themselves as well. So from the perspective of Contrary, like the whole VC landscape is so competitive. And I'm curious in terms of like how you guys are trying to position yourself strategically. Like what are some of the key things that you guys are focusing on as it relates to positioning in venture capital?
Yeah. So I think that there is sort of the existential differentiation that we have, right? Like how do we really establish a specific philosophical approach to what we do? And then there's a little bit the like nuts and bolts, of like how do we do that differently? And it's maybe specific things, smaller things that are not as noticeable on the outside, but compound into how we set ourselves apart. Mm-hmm. So I think philosophically first, when you step back, I think that the vast majority of venture, even though they talk about how everybody talks about how venture is a relationship business, right? It's important to have these deep relationships. For most venture firms, they are very company centric in all of the things that they do, the way that they source companies and look to invest and negotiate and things like that, like the way that they add value. It's very company centric. And I joke that like in previous roles, I would often play the hurry up and wait game where like I knew somebody super sharp and I was like, okay, like as soon as you start a company, I'm ready. We've got stuff we can do. We can lead your seed round. We can do all this stuff, whatever. But until then, there's not a lot I can do. Like maybe I can invite you to dinner once a quarter or something, right? Like I'm kind of just waiting around the hoop. Whereas at Contrary, we have deliberately invested in a very long funnel where we want to find people as early as we can. So some people in our network, we have known for 5 or 6 years. Like the entire time Contrary has existed, we have known these people. And we got to know them in undergrad and help them get exposure to startups and maybe make some of their early initial investments as a scout. Then we help them get a job at maybe a larger tech company where they can establish themselves and learn a bunch of skills. Then we help them join a startup and we invested in that startup and we got to help them kind of build that network with other folks. And then they went to start a company. And by that time, it's been 4 or 5 years. We've had multiple positive touch points. And a lot of times these folks won't even run a process. They'll just call us. And they've known us long enough that it's like, we need to shop around. We know you. Let's just do this. We can crush it. So that is like a very long game that other firms can't just like snap their fingers and say, oh, we want to do more of that. Like it's taken years of investment and then that investment compounds over time. So when we talk about being a talent-centric firm, that is a critical piece of it. The research-driven element is something that as we evolve as a firm, we're constantly looking for what we think of as like almost like product SKUs, where it's like if I map out somebody's entire career, right, from basically like when they're in school figuring out they like startups, all the way through to like working at companies, starting companies, exiting companies, angel investing as an exited founder, like all the way through that journey, where are the different points that we can help them? And one of the sort of most like slap us in the face things that we noticed was that getting a grasp on and being able to effectively tell the story of private companies is really complicated because it's so mired in content marketing, right? It's just very fluffy. Yep. And it's people sort of press releases and trying to stuff like that. But in terms of like legitimately getting the story out there and being able to really articulate why this is different than that or how a certain company stands apart or whatever, that storytelling aspect is a very common problem that you have almost throughout your career. Because when you're early in your career, you're trying to understand those stories. And when you're later in your career, you're trying to tell those stories. And so storytelling is really critical, not in a fluffy narrative sense, but in a like pragmatic, detail oriented sense. And so that was where the research element became much more critical. So that's a lot of how we think about contrary being different. And then like there's a myriad of micro things that we do about our programming and the relationships that we have and the follow-up that we have and the way we incentivize people to work with us and the way we run contrary research and all these things, but they're all informed by we are trying to find the sharpest people in the world and support them at any point throughout their life.
Fascinating. It is interesting because this idea of the best stories kind of winning and just having a huge competitive advantage is an idea that came up in the marketing and advertising learning sprint that I was doing. And I'm reminded of, I think it was a Sam Altman interview where he was basically explaining that he gets tired, or he encourages startup entrepreneurs not to do startups that are I guess commonplace, and he pushes them to become like incredibly ambitious, specifically because the more ambitious that your aspirations are, the more likely it is that you're going to corral a group of people to actually provide support and energy and enthusiasm around you. Mm-hmm. And I think it's probably true of companies, but it's also true of just like individuals, generally speaking. And I think about that, like even in my own life, is am I being ambitious enough? Am I doing something remarkable enough that it's going to be worth other people sharing and talking about? And it's kind of like a harsh reality that I have thought about more, because there's this like Seth Godin quote that like only remarkable products gets like basically attention and the boring stuff dies. And I imagine that you probably think a lot about this kind of idea as it relates to companies and which ones succeed and which ones don't, and this whole like self-fulfilling prophecy aspect of investing as well.
Yeah. Well, I would say that number one, probably the topic that I have written most frequently about on my blog is storytelling, and like this element of like narrative and nuance and finding that effective way to tell a story that, you know, there's a balance between like, you know, lying and dreaming the dream. And a lot of people walk a fine line between that, right? And I'm much more focused on how do you effectively dream the dream and stuff like that. But the other thing, to your point on ambition, I also wrote a blog post a couple weeks ago called The Non-Zero Sum Game of Ambition. And the whole idea is that like the more we can all do to increase everyone's ambition, like you being more ambitious and me being ambitious, it's not a zero-sum game, right? Like we can all be incredibly ambitious and chasing really big visions. Maybe if you and I get ambitious in the same direction, we start competing with each other. But even competition doesn't have to whet our ambition. It can be this opportunity to spur that ambition, right? To drive us to compete harder. And I mean, you look at like the sort of early PayPal and X.com story and stuff, and people talk often about the company once it's combined and what it did and the talent density there and stuff. But what they often don't talk about is like the competition between those two companies was ferocious, and in many ways was the thing that sort of like created it was forged in those fires of that competition between the two of them that made them capable of going forward, right? I think everybody benefits from that.
Your Substack is Investing 101 2.0. I think you started it a couple of years ago. And I'm curious in terms of, like, yes, you're an investor of financial capital, but I guess just like as a human, you are an allocator of your like time, your energy, all that good stuff. And you decided to like start this Substack. You publish it weekly. Was curious a little bit about the motivation behind doing that, and you continue to publish weekly and have enjoyed a lot of the posts in preparation for this discussion. So I'm curious like why you decided to start that and allocate time to it consistently.
Yeah, so I had written on and off for a while, and then when I went to Coatue, because Coatue is such an active public markets investor, there's a lot more rules and requirements around stuff, and so I kind of stopped while I was at Coatue putting out anything. I wasn't on Twitter, I wasn't writing or anything, and then kind of thought about it again at Index, and then didn't really pick it up again until after I had left. But one of the biggest drivers, and I have this quote on my personal website and on Twitter and stuff, but it's this idea of I don't know what I think until I read what I say. So that's why I write, right? is sort of expressing myself. And when I thought about that idea, because I'd always also had this like insecurity of writing is just shouting into the void, right? Like there's so much content, there's so much noise, everybody's sharing their opinions on everything and every possible digital medium that you could possibly think of. And it's like, I'm just adding to it. Like I'm not even reading enough of the stuff to like feel good about myself. Why should I be adding to the pile of unread stuff? That was my biggest limitation of like really doing it consistently. And a really good friend of mine who I worked with at Index, Rex Woodbury, he had written on Substack for a long time. And he helped me really change my framing of this, where it's like, I actually don't care if anybody reads my stuff. The most valuable thing is for me to write it and put it out there. And it forces me to crystallize my thinking. Even if no one reads it, I am better off having written that thing. But by putting it out there, I also invite people to tell me where I'm stupid or to react to it or whatever. And that is helpful, right? To see what resonates with people and what doesn't. It sort of recrafts my thinking and stuff. And so that's how I thought about it. And so when I set out to write consistently, instead of saying like, oh, I want to get to this many subscribers or I want to have this many views or whatever, I was like, I'm going to set one goal and one goal only. And the only goal I care about is that I have to publish once a week. That's it. Like, I don't care who reads it. I don't care how good it is. And if you go back and look through some of my posts, like they are not all winners. Some of them are like, I'm running out of time and my kids are screaming and I don't know what else to write about. And here's some random put together thoughts, right? But just keeping that one goal. So I've kept that every week since 2022, like all of 22 and 23 into today. And that's been my one goal and thus far have been successful.
I think it might have been your very first post that you had published. You had basically done like a breakdown of Rome research and how that tool has kind of like supercharged your thinking and has created like what Tiago Forte might say is like a second brain. One of the things that I continue to find a lot of value in is like even having my own personal website of referencing back to a lot of the things just for myself of like books that I read, quotes that I remembered, or like essays that I published that like I somehow just forgot that I had published them. And they like re-jog interesting memories and ideas in my brain. And I'm curious, like, how you first stumbled upon Rome and why you were so excited about it. And maybe just like this broader idea of like having this web of information that is out there and you can like tie a bunch of disparate ideas together, the power in that, and like how it's like changed you as like an investor and just a person operating in the world.
Yeah. So this kind of goes back to I served a 2-year mission for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And while I was doing that, there is a scripture we talk about. It references the New Testament, but it's in a different book of scripture. But it says, whatsoever you shall record on earth shall be recorded in heaven. And it's this idea of that, like, we should be a record-keeping people, and journals are important, and histories are important, and Mormons are very obsessed with family history and things like that. Like, we're very record-keeping people. And as I learned that on my mission, that just became, like, dogmatically entrenched in me. And so while I was on my mission, I filled 11, like, study journals worth of notes and things I wrote down and quotes and things like that. And so since then, I have been, like, an avid note-taker, since I was 19 years old. And I have gone from Evernote to Notion, and then I found Rome during COVID. And the thing that was most powerful for me about Rome is that I had always had these like loosely interconnected thoughts of like, I thought a lot about unions and I had read a bunch about unions and I had like done a bunch of deep dives into that topic. But I'd also thought about city building and I had also thought about architecture and I'd also thought about art. And there was a bunch of interconnected things where it's like, well, like city building and Walt Disney, it's like, yes, that's art, but it's also architecture because he was like, you think about the urban design of Disneyland and there's something valuable about that. And that impacts city building and people's, urban experience and blah, blah, blah. All these ideas are interconnected. They do not fit into a folder, right? There's not like a city building folder. And it's like, I only think about this and I only think about this. I was constantly interconnected in my thinking. And that was always really hard for me. And I'd have to make these, and I did the same thing in scriptures too, where I would like read my scriptures and I'd find a scripture and I'd say, this reminds me of this. And I'd have these massive scripture chains of like, go look at this and go look at this and these things connect and whatever. And so finding Rome was this like revelatory experience. And to this day, I am an hourly active user. Like my whole life is in Rome. And the biggest value, and I've seen other apps come and go and stuff and that I've taken a look at and things, but the most valuable thing of Rome is that it has this idea of like an atomic thought, like the atomic unit of a thought. And in Rome, every single bullet point throughout the entire database has a unique identifier. And it's almost like Excel, where you say like equals A1. There's something in A1 that I'm now pulling into this thing. And I can trace back, like, where did it come from? It came from A1. What's in A1? It's reflected here, right? And Rome has the same thing where I can block reference ideas from all across my map. And so, for example, I might have a quote that's one place in my graph where, I have a quote from F. Scott Fitzgerald that I really like, that it basically is the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to have two opposing ideas in your head at the same time and still be able to function. And like I have that quote one place in my graph, but I've block referenced it in a dozen places. And so I can now see everywhere in my brain that I've ever thought that quote was relevant in one click. And it drops down and I can see here's everywhere I've ever thought about this idea in context. And that's really powerful for me. And I have that across every company I've thought of, every space I've dove deep on, and, all kinds of different areas of my life.
There's a lot of people on Twitter that talk about, if you are a low-level employee, one way that you can add a ton of value instantly is simply by taking detailed notes in the meetings that you're in and having like an organized structure to retrieve those notes and provide like summaries of what was talked about. And from a personal perspective, having something like Rome Research, it seems like it would like amplify your life a ton. Your very first post, I think, was the breakdown of Rome Research. So for those people that are interested, I'll leave a link in the show notes. You mentioned kind of scriptures and your Mormon faith. In venture capital in general, in like the technology industry, I feel like religion can get a pretty bad rap. And like curious overall how your faith, how being a member in the LDS like church, how you feel like that might have influenced your investing approach at all. Do you think that there is some themes or overlaps there in terms of like how you think as an investor?
I definitely do. I think that probably the two biggest ways that my religious beliefs have impacted my career as an investor. Number one is just like how it impacts my entire life, right? Which like informs my career. So I got married when I was 22 and I had my first kid when I was 24. So I've not really been an adult without a wife and kids. And that has like dramatically reformed my priorities. And even going back to my mission, I spent 2 years, number one, getting the most, like the deepest, most personal rejections every day, all day that you can experience, right? There's a reason that Utah has an exceptional pool of sales talent. It's because if you can sell Jesus and get rejected in a very personal way, it's really easy to sell software and get rejected, right? Yeah. But that experience on my mission was like the most transformative experience in my life of just like crafting resilience. And then my family becomes a very critical prioritization forcing function. And so all of those things have just impacted my overall career, right? Like what's a priority to me? And I'd say that like, nothing about my life is casual, right? Like I don't have a lot of like casual endeavors. Like if I'm doing something, it often is taking me away from my family. And so it better be really worth doing and a really high priority. So if that forcing prioritization has been really important. But then the second thing is like, we talk a lot about, and people in general, not just that my firm is named Contrary, but in general in the investing world, we talk about contrarian ideas. And like increasingly believing in God is a contrarian view. But in my opinion, being able to like analytically and like in an intellectually honest way, both have a faith in something that is very complex and outside the norm of like what most people would think of as like falsifiable, that forces me to stand up for a belief that is not commonly held, especially in the circles within sort of, tech and a lot of what is a very like liberal, Bay Area culture and stuff like that. Like it forces me to have something that most people disagree with and even like would, think less of me for and stuff. And rather than being this like dogmatic, like, oh no, I just, like I have all these dumb reasons for thinking what I think, and I'm just going to ignore everyone. It is a valuable exercise for me to take in criticisms from other people and say, why do I believe what I believe, even though these people say this and this person has this point or whatever. And that impacts everything that I think about my investing. And again, I just wrote another piece, I think just this past week, where I talked about like, there is value not just in dreaming the dream, but in also asking the question, like, where could I be wrong? And that informs and sort of pressure tests my own thinking. And I think that I have a pretty well balanced view of, like, I believe in God and in a very broad, subset of topics that I have thought a lot about. And I have pretty good reasons for believing certain things. And I don't think that I'm just like because the Bible said so type of Christian, right? Like, I think I've thought about it a little bit more. And that's been really valuable for me, both in my faith and in just being a more intellectually honest person.
You mentioned that you have three young kids, and I am curious as well because yes, you are an investor, you're a venture capitalist, but like ultimately you're like a curious learner as well, and that's evident based on like your writing and also based on your personal websites. From the perspective of education in general, like education for young people, K through 12, and also afterwards. I'm curious, like, how you are thinking about raising your kids, because it's one thing for people to opine on how the education structure should exist, not having kids, but then it's another forcing function to be very deliberate for people that do have kids of like what ideas they're exposing them to and how they are like creating curriculum so that they can basically digest as much knowledge that will help them in the future as possible. I'm curious, like, how you've thought about, I guess, educating your kids, ideas that you want to instill in them, and also like their, I guess, like daily curriculum.
So I've also written a piece about this. It's called The Rising Generation. And I kind of reflect on some of the things that have informed my view as a parent. But if there was one thing, and it's always funny to me because the way I heard about this quote was from a comedian who was making fun of this quote being stupid. But I think it's a pretty good quote. And whether or not Abraham Lincoln said it or not, I don't know. Wiki quotes can decide on that. But the general idea is whatever you are, be a good one. And I think that is like a very important sort of like foundational thesis statement for the way that I think about parenting. Because I think that there are a lot of people. So I'll say two things. Number one, I really like, Palmer Luckey is one of our portfolio founders. We invested in Andrew Earl, and he talks about this a lot, where he talks about like this idea that people will tell kids like, hey, just pursue your passions, pursue your dreams. And he's like, in many cases, that's stupid. Like most people, like if you're like, you love painting, it's like, great. Statistically, like you're not going to make a lot of money painting, and you're not going to make a huge contribution to society as a painter. And so that's probably not a good idea to push a ton of people towards, liberal arts or painting or whatever. And then there are the other group of people who think that that's dismissive, and like by not having people more exposed to liberal arts and becoming more cultured, it creates a generation of sort of less sophisticated or thoughtful or human people. And I think that like both of those are missing an important element. And I think that my perspective of like whatever you are, be a good one, comes from this idea of like, I'm not as mad as folks like Palmer or, Delian at Founders Fund or whatever. They get pretty fired up about this idea that like, hey, like what is the number one thing that most people want to be? And it's like a social media influencer or a YouTuber or whatever. And it's like, I'm not as mad about that. I just recognize the odds, because there's not different odds in being a successful YouTuber than there is in like playing in the NFL or whatever, right? Candidly, maybe there's better odds of being a creator and influencer because like you have a much broader audience and you can find this niche market. And there are people on TikTok that have millions of followers and all they do is make videos of mushroom foraging and tactics for finding mushrooms and stuff. So like the internet candidly opens up a world of niche markets that you can play to that the NFL doesn't have an equivalent to, right?
Yep.
So all of this stuff has very low odds. Rather than telling my kids, don't be an artist, don't be a YouTuber, don't play for the NFL, whatever, that is like very reactive to that child's progression. Instead, it is proactively nurturing that child's progression. And so when I think about helping my kids, I want whatever they want to be. I just want to encourage them to be good at that thing. It's not that I don't want you to be an artist. It's that if you're going to be an artist, you need to recognize that the odds of you being a successful artist are very, very low. And you need to be an absolute master of your craft. Like I look at Mr. Beast, and I love Mr. Beast and hearing him talk on podcasts and stuff like that, because what he talks about is not like, he's not a typical, there are plenty of people on the internet who've built massive followings for being atrocious, terrible human beings. And that's a bummer. And I don't want my kids to do that. But I look at Mr. Beast and the way he talks about his craft, it's like literally like, I mean, I think the one stat said, if you look at his publishing history, he has posted a YouTube video once every 10 days for the last 10 years. And he constantly is talking about like understanding the craft of how he does what he does and what's going to be successful and what people are interested in, how to curate storytelling in a certain way. And so like he is absolutely a unicorn founder of a massive successful enterprise. My kid, if he wants to be a YouTuber, can be that, but he should recognize the importance of understanding like what it means to be good at that thing. And so that's a more informed perspective, I think, to help your kids, rather than, because one of the other things is like if you just say like you can't be XYZ and they crap on, you know, wanting to be an animator or wanting to be a whatever, then it's like you'd really damage your relationship with your kid. Like your job as a parent is supposed to evolve from this like caretaker early on to more of a sort of advisor and coach later in their life. And you're not a very good coach if you're just constantly crapping on everything that's important to them.
Yeah. It makes a lot of sense. I mean, it kind of, the Mr. Beast commentary raises a question that I have, because you would think that you would hope that if you came across Mr. Beast before he was successful and could just have a conversation with him, that maybe you'd be able to pick up on some cues about him as a person that would lead you to bet on him. And like, I guess that's what kind of a venture capitalist does across various industries. From a talent perspective, when you're like evaluating founders and trying to dissect which ones will be successful and which ones won't, it's interesting to hear stories. I'm reading Power Law right now by Sebastian Mallaby, and just the amount of times that notable figures have been overlooked by people who seems like they would have had good judgment in determining whether or not somebody could or couldn't be successful. I'm curious from your perspective how much talent is a intuition-based dynamic versus how much of it can be boiled down to a science. Like your overall take on how maybe Contrary and you yourself approach talent assessment.
Yeah, I think that the way that I'd frame it is there is this quote in Walter Isaacson's biography of Leonardo da Vinci, where in effect, I don't remember the exact quote word for word, I've quoted it a couple of times in my writing, but in effect, he talks about how Da Vinci became this sort of master student, and he understood all of the very specific rules of texture and shading and like object orientation and perspective and things like that. He understood those rules perfectly so that he could break them. And so and there's a lot of people who just say, you know, I don't play by the rules. I'm an abstract artist and blah, 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 whatever. I do things by my own playbook. And it's like what that misses is a multi-generation foundation of principles. And so I think that in most disciplines, and I think identifying talent is one, there is a critical element of understanding the rules and heuristics, but then knowing when to break those rules. And so, for example, like at Contrary, we have dozens of heuristics that we think about when we're evaluating talent. One of those being, for example, like the slope of someone's career, right? Like how quickly they progress through the things that they do. Another one is like demonstrations of deep obsession, where somebody has become the absolute best at a very specific thing, even if it's a really esoteric thing, but demonstrating the discipline to become one of the very best at that thing. And then in particular, when it comes to like founder product fit, where like this is a good founder for like why this founder in this problem. This isn't always there, but there is an element of like, is this the person that I would call? Like if I was trying to solve a problem in this particular space and I could call anyone in the world, would I call this person? And maybe that is because they have such a unique perspective on this space that like it would be the most valuable perspective, or maybe because it's the most detailed and in-depth understanding of a space or whatever. There's dozens of heuristics like that. But often some of the best people that we have found break those rules. Like we often say that, you know, our unique value prop and network is really well built for somebody who is sort of, whether it's like a first-time founder or early in their career or like continuing to build out their network or whatever. Like we can be really helpful for those people. If somebody has been like a, you know, multiple times founder, has a deep established network, when they start a new company, they're just going to hire the same executives from their last company. You know, we're maybe not as valuable for those people. But then one of our most successful portfolio founders is Palmer Luckey. And so you look at like the background that he's had, and it is very much outside of the typical mold. But what we saw was that there is this like very specific, unique talent density shift going on, where people who have a certain element of patriotism and a certain value system recognize the value of working in defense and want to move towards that. And he was becoming a conduit for that talent. And so even though he as an individual didn't perfectly fit our bill, we didn't let that turn us off. Rather, we turned around and said, okay, this is going to be a really powerful conduit for these people who do want to change and like have a really specific skill set and can now apply it in defense. That is a thing worth paying attention to, even if it doesn't perfectly fit our rubric.
Related to that, and related to the quote, that Abraham Lincoln quote that you had mentioned of like, whatever you are or whatever you become, like, be a good one. In the world of like venture capital, you have, I think, written about this fact that if you look at the venture capital landscape overall, this idea of like justifying your existence, of like there are a large swath of VCs that probably shouldn't be in the business of venture capital, and that maybe over time that'll become more clear. In terms of like, if you were to look forward 5, 10, 15 years plus, and categorize the venture capital firms that succeed compared to those that just like don't deserve to be playing in the arena right now, is it like clear to you the handful of things that the good VCs are doing over the next 10 years to stand out versus those that really don't deserve to be playing the game?
I think that there's two elements to it. Number one is, in venture, brand is a very powerful dynamic, more so than almost any industry you can think of. Mark Andreessen, in one of his tweet storms, talks about this idea of like borrowed credibility, where like one of the reasons why I want a very well-established high brand firm is because customers, candidates, partners, whatever, are going to look at that and say, oh, this company is backed by so-and-so. Like, that's a pretty good, I've heard of them. That's a pretty good brand. Like, that's borrowed credibility, right? Even though I've never heard of this company, I've never heard of this founder, that's valuable. And so some of it is just that there's enough of a halo effect of like success breeds success. And so if you as an investor have been able to invest in a lot of successful companies, that will continue to compound for you. Even candidly, if you're not a very good firm, you're not very helpful, you're not a very good investor often, right? Like, that can still compound despite all of that. And in many cases, that also is driven by LP loyalty, where like, if I'm an LP and I've invested in a fund and that fund has made me quite a bit of money, I have a very distinct sense of loyalty to that person who has returned meaningful capital to me. And so that can often last multiple funds, sometimes a decade of funds, because of that, handful of successful instances. So there's one sort of just like broad swath of like, why are some firms successful? In many ways, it's just because they've been successful / lucky, and that compounds as a halo effect. The other piece of that, though, when I look at the firms that I see as like truly generational, either like have been generationally successful or I think are poised to be generational successes, I think that it does boil down to that they have a very distinct reason for their existence. And the way that I frame that is like asking the question, if I'm a founder, why would I hire so-and-so's money? And if ultimately the only reason I'm hiring, so like, it brings me back to another question of people say, would you rather have, if you could only have one, would you rather have a Harvard degree or a Harvard education? And it's like, most people would probably just rather have the Harvard degree. Like, I don't really care that much about the education. Like, it's fine, right? But like, if you knew, another way of framing it is, Warren Buffett says, would you rather be known to the world as the world's greatest lover, but actually be the worst lover? Or would you rather be the world's greatest lover, but be known as the world's worst lover? Like, what is more important to you, aesthetics or reality? And for a lot of people, aesthetics matter more than reality. And so if you think about, why am I hiring this firm? Oh, it's just because like, I'm not going to get anything out of them other than like slapping their brand on my website. Then it's like, that is a firm that does not have staying power, right? Like, it's not going to stick around forever if it's just brand. But other firms have answered the question of, the reason you hire our money is XYZ. And every great firm has a very specific answer to that question. Some better than others, right? And maybe some are discovering it and figuring it out and stuff like that. But I think increasingly that will become an important question for every firm to answer.
Yeah, I mean, the name of the company is Contrary, and you referenced the Fitzgerald quote. One of the things that I continue to just be like shocked by is, there's that psychology study where they have a group of Confederates and they're kind of just staring at the sky, and random individuals who are just passing by will just stand and look up and try and figure out what they're looking at. And this like mimetic desire, this herd behavior, the amount that it accounts for very unusual phenomenon, and phenomenon like whether or not a company is successful versus not. That whole like just early proof, whether or not it's justified, is it shocks me every time I hear stories about the success of a company hinging on something that very early on could have gone one way or the other. It's kind of a cruel thing about reality to some extent.
Yeah. Well, I've written about that a fair bit where like I feel like I used to think that between reality and narrative, ultimately reality would always win out. And increasingly, I have come to the conclusion that narrative really can shape reality. And I think that's an element of why storytelling is so important to us as a firm as well, is that like finding that way to craft that narrative is very critical. And in many ways, it's not like there's, lying and exaggeration and content marketing fluff. And then there's like really pragmatic, like, almost like academic level. Well, even academia is sort of drifting towards content marketing, right? But it's like really like detailed truth telling. Like candidly, narrative shapes reality in such a way. And like this idea of like a self-fulfilling prophecy that like, I don't think that you can afford to be an intellectual purist when you say, no, all we can ever do is explicitly just tell the bare bones facts. And it's like, no, like you have to be able to tell a story and dream the dream. There is a fine line between lying and exaggerating and committing, wire fraud and stuff, right?
Yep.
But like being able to craft a narrative is one of the most critical skills. And candidly, I think is like when you look at people like Elon Musk, that is one of the most powerful things that he has is that ability to tell an incredibly effective story.
From the perspective of being an investor, being a learner overall, in terms of like reading books, you have like a bookshelf, a catalog of books that you've previously read, and then you have like a special category for what you call like Quake books that I understand you got from Ryan Holiday, which are just like books that had a deep impact on your life in some way. And one of them that piqued my interest was John Quincy Adams. I think it was like A Militant Spirit or something like that. That book, I'm curious in terms of what impact that had on you and why it deserved recognition in your list of Quake books.
It's a really I don't think John Quincy Adams is anybody's favorite president. Like it's a very weird book to enjoy so much. I think that part of where it stems from is I also, and probably this could be a Quake book too, just because of the contribution to reading John Quincy Adams. But I read David McCullough's biography of John Adams while I was living in Boston years and years ago. And that was like just a really interesting experience for me. And like going back to the idea of like narrative and storytelling, contrasting Thomas Jefferson and John Adams is a really interesting exercise in like understanding human nature and understanding why America sort of became the country that it is and has these like weird tastes of like human optimism and pessimism, like sort of counteropposed to each other. But like the reason that John Quincy Adams, I enjoyed it so much, I think, is because probably two reasons. Number one, like understanding him and his family's dynamic of like educational excellence above anything else. Like that is really powerful. And there are stories and pieces, like for example, when he was the ambassador to Russia, he had a 5-year-old son that he brought with him. And basically like he had a certain amount of time allotted to doing his duties. But outside of that, he often would spend several hours with his son every morning reading, the Bible in English and Latin and talking about what it meant and stuff like that and like contributing to his education and stuff like that. And like there is I think that like there's power in this like value of education. He also later taught a course at Harvard, sort of an oratory class and talk about logic and ethos and things. Like there's just all these elements of education that were really impactful to me. But then on top of that, he was like a voracious note taker as well and journal keeper. And I really resonated with that. And in many cases, like in the early days of the sort of, post-revolution, early American experiment, like there's a lot of stuff that we only understand because of his journals. And so all of those things I think together just really resonated with me on a personal level. And I don't know that he's always, he's not the ultimate role model. He's not the ultimate president, but there was a lot of stuff about his life that really impacted me.
Before we wrap up, because I know that we're going to be coming up on time here, you're in your early 30s? Is that right?
That's right. Yeah.
I'm curious in terms of the experiences that you had in your 20s, like professionally, I guess it's a bit of a unique situation because you got married very early, you had kids early, but you still had like a handful of very impressive professional experiences. In terms of how you've approached or thought about your career in your 20s and like what quote unquote success would look like, and has that shifted at all as you've like entered your 30s? Just curious about like overall your life mapping of like what you're aspiring towards. Has that evolved over time?
I had a friend of mine tell this sort of elaborate analogy to explain life and careerism and stuff like that. And it's basically this idea of like the world has just two different types of people. They have people who build and drive trains, and they have hobos, and that's it. Those are the only two kinds of people. And either you are building and driving your own train, or you are a hobo jumping from somebody else's train to somebody else's train. And whether you like it or not, you are along for the ride in that train. And there's probably a pyramid scheme of like other people's trains are actually on a microcosm of massive trains that are driven by, BlackRock or whatever. I don't know. But like thinking about that framework for my life has been very impactful. And I think that earlier in my career, it was enough for me to be riding on other people's trains because I appreciated the destination, right? And it was valuable for me to learn along that journey with somebody else on their sort of train ride. Increasingly, it has become important to me, and even you look at Contrary, like I didn't start Contrary, and so I'm still working with somebody who is driving that ultimate vision, and I'm okay with that.
Yep.
But I think that ultimately you're sort of taking responsibility more and more for the direction of the trains that you're riding. And I think that has become more important to me. I candidly think like I probably should have learned that lesson earlier in my life, that the more I'm riding someone else's train, no matter how influential I think I am, or no matter how far up the train I think I am, I'm ultimately never the one leading or dictating where my life goes. And so the more sort of control I can take over my own destination, I think the more fulfilling that is in my own life and how I think about things and how proud I am of the things that I accomplish and stuff like that. And I think that there's far too many people who are happy to ride sort of just at the back of other people's trains.
Very well said. Kyle, appreciate you joining the podcast. Really enjoyed the conversation and the preparation in the lead up, and I'm looking forward to sharing it with the rest of the audience.
Yeah, this is super fun, Tyler. Thank you for having me.